Welcome back, everyone. Let's jump right in. Today's historical linguistics lecture is going to completely tear down a 15th-century-old myth. We're going to deconstruct the true etymology of the people we historically know as the Lombards, or the Longobardi. By digging into some primary linguistic evidence, we're going to uncover a pretty wild story of phonetic mistranslation. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. The myth of the beard. 2. The absence of the nasal. 3. The phonetic shift from lag to lang. 4. Longobardi, the guardians. 5. Some toponymic evidence. And finally, 6. Historical bias. All right, part 1. The myth of the beard and the popular ex post etymology. For centuries, traditional history has told us that the name Longobardi literally just means long beard, supposedly coming from the Germanic words long and Bart. But here's the kicker. Even Paul the Deacon, the famous 8th century historian of the Lombards who actually recorded that origin story about the god Odin and his wife Freya, explicitly called it a ridicula fabula, a ridiculous fable. He knew it was nonsense. This tells us we're dealing with a later, popular etymology. It was basically an invention, created after the fact, to justify a term whose real original root had been totally lost after centuries of migrations. Which brings us to part 2, the absence of the nasal, looking directly at the primary Greek sources. Now this is where the phonetic mystery really gets good. Latin sources, like Tacitus, lock in the form lang with an N super early on. But look at the Greek sources. Writers like Strabo, Ptolemy, and Procopius, the guys who documented some of the very first contacts with these people, they write the root as lanko, lako, or lago. Notice what's missing? There is absolutely zero nasal N or Greek nu. If the original Germanic root was lang, meaning long, Greek speakers had the exact letter to transcribe that perfectly, but they didn't use it. Why? Because the original root never had a nasal sound in the first place. We have literally been basing centuries of history on the wrong root word. Let's move on to part 3, phonetics. How exactly did we get from lag to lang via the parasitic N mechanism? Think of this like a massive game of historical telephone. Step 1. The true original Germanic root is log, meaning a seat or a military camp, and it ends in a voiced velar stop, a hard G. Step 2. To write this hard G sound in the middle of a word, the Greek language often uses a double gamma. But in Greek phonetics, a double gamma automatically creates a nasalization. It sounds like the N in the English word angle. Step 3. The Latins come along, they look at that Greek spelling, and they just read it completely literally. They totally miss the nuance that it was just a Greek spelling trick for hard G, and bam, they stabilize the form lang in Latin texts forever. If we look closely at how the early Greek geographers tried to spell it, we see exactly what they were up to. Ptolemy writes lako with a double kappa, swapping the G for K just to keep that hard stop sound without making it nasal. Strabo writes loggo with a final kappa, trying to harden the velar without nasalizing it. They weren't making mistakes. They were making highly precise, deliberate attempts to capture a really tough Germanic sound, intentionally avoiding the exact nasalization trap that eventually caught the Romans. So, part 4, Longobardi, the guardians. We are shifting from facial hair to true military function. If we strip away that mistaken parasitic N, we replace lang with lagar. And class, that changes everything. Longobardi. Lagar translates to the seat, or the fortified camp. Wardi comes from the Germanic root for guardians or defenders. Put it together, the guardians of the seat, or the keepers of the fortified camp. This completely shatters our historical understanding of their role in society. They weren't just a bunch of guys defined by long facial hair. They were a highly organized, specialized military force. But what about the beard part, the Bart? Well, the Germanic root wart started with a W sound that was slowly evolving into a V. For a Greek writer back then, the absolute only letter available to render that V sound was beta. So transcribing lagowart as Longobardi with a beta was actually a brilliant phonetic choice. But the Latins? They came in later, lazily distorted that V sound into a hard B, and conveniently linked it to their own word barba, meaning beard. Problem solved? Incorrectly. Let's back this up in part 5, toponymic evidence. We're going to look for linguistic fossils right here in the Italian territory. We can actually see this parasitic NAM mechanism happening dynamically on a map. Let's look at the town of Linghirano in the province of Parma. It's a literal linguistic fossil. In the year 1038, official documents called it luggerano. No nasal sound. It perfectly preserves the original lugger root. It wasn't until later in the Middle Ages, as Romance phonetics started smoothing out those harsh Germanic roots, that an epenthetic N was shoved in there to make it easier to say, giving us langhurano today. We see the exact same thing down in southern Italy. Because places like Apulia and Laconia had heavy cultural influence from the Byzantine Empire for so long, the original phonetics actually survived. If you look at the Barisi diplomatic code from the 10th and 11th centuries, it frequently says Laugobardia. Those Greek-influenced scribes weren't spelling it wrong. They were accurately recording the name without the Latin corruption, because Greek phonetics didn't force that nasalization on them.
Which brings us to our final discussion, Part 6, Historical Bias. Let's look beyond just intellectual laziness.
The source material poses a really dramatic, almost uncomfortable question for us as scholars today. How on earth is it possible that for 15 centuries we just accepted a tavern tale about longbeards? How do we take a title as dense and perfectly strategic as Loggerwardi, the guardians of the camp, and trivialize it for over a millennia? The research argues that this wasn't just some innocent typo. The text suggests it was born out of a deep-seated cultural arrogance from ancient Greek and Roman historians. The analysis argues that these ancient writers essentially imposed their own grammatical boxes onto Germanic peoples, treating them simply as the barbarian other. Instead of doing the hard work to understand the real, rough phonetics of the Germanic language, they forced the name into something that sounded familiar to them, creating a dismissive caricature. So here is your main takeaway for today. Getting this right isn't just a fun philology exercise. The text concludes it's actually an act of historical justice. We have to stop viewing them through the biased lens of ancient Roman and Greek historians. The Lombards were not some aesthetic oddity that stumbled into Italy. They were the formidable military machine that literally refounded Europe, the guardians of the Lombards. As you go forward and read historical texts, I want to leave you with this thought. How much of the history we accept as absolute fact is really just a phonetic misunderstanding born of cultural bias? Keep questioning the sources, everyone. Thanks for joining me for this explainer today.